Welcome to Chapter 1, 3 Social Value Systems, a Closer Look. No large-scale society is uniform. Any large-scale society includes a wide range of diversities. Diversity certainly keeps life interesting, but diversity is also a challenge to human unity. Part of the diversity of Western society today is that it possesses several influential value systems, often in conflict with each other. Here in Chapter 1, we'll take a deeper dive into the 3 value systems I introduced in our previous video. But here I will also introduce the larger conceptual system they are all part of, namely liberal individualism, otherwise known as liberalism. These labels are a convenient way to identify and talk about different sorts of ideas. However, each one of these labels is really a family of values, ideas, and practices. We should also note that people may never have heard of such labels as libertarianism or hyper-individualism, yet they may still live by these social values because they have subconsciously absorbed them simply by living in our libertarian-saturated culture. At the same time, while a person might apply these hyper-individualist values in some parts of their life, they might apply humanitarian or communitarian values in other parts of their life. To make an observation similar to that made by Paul in Romans 7:15, we humans can be far from consistent in the values we live by. We should also note that each of these value systems will have different degrees of influence within any particular context. That is, some parts of Western society will have greater libertarian influence than others. So I will now begin to describe these 3 value systems in greater detail, but I will frame this discussion through one of the most ancient questions in moral thought, because each of these value systems addresses in its own way the following question. What is the right or best relationship between community norms, such as laws, rules, standards, expectations, on the one hand, and individual freedom on the other? I will repeat that question because it is so central to what this series is about. What is the right or best relationship between community norms and individual freedom? Here we should note that community refers to the reality of belonging to multiple communities. Rarely, if ever, do we belong to just one community, for we simultaneously have many sorts of communities in which we participate and to which we belong. Thus, the singular term community actually refers to any and all types of communities that people are involved in. So answers to this question fall on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum are conformist or traditionalist societies, which place a strong priority on community over the individual. In these contexts, individuals are expected to conform to social rules, conventions, expectations, and traditions, with limited space being permitted for individual voice, choice, or initiative. In some extreme contexts, certain individuals, especially slaves and women, are permitted virtually no individual expression or choice at all, such as women under Taliban rule today, though fortunately few conformist or traditionalist societies are so extreme. There are also penalties for violations of the community's expectations. At the other end of the spectrum comes individualism, whereby a society places greater value on individual freedom than on conformity to communal or societal expectations. Again, though, there is a spectrum here. One individualist society may place only slightly more weight on individual freedom than on conformity to community expectations, while another society might place significantly more weight on individual freedom than on community expectations. Individualist societies have, though, been rare in recorded history, being an innovation in Western society over the past couple centuries. As we will see in later chapters, individualism has emerged through an historical process over many centuries, yet the shape that individualism has taken over the past 2 centuries is known as liberalism. And it is from liberalism that hyper-individualism or libertarianism has emerged as the most extreme form of liberalism. In effect, to understand the hyper-individualist parts of society today means first having to understand that form of individualism called liberalism, for it is from liberalism that hyper-individualism arises. The words liberal and liberty come from the Latin word liber, meaning free. So the heart of liberal values is individual liberty or freedom. Yet, like most labels, liberalism is actually a family of ideas or values. And like many families, some ideas in the liberal family don't always get along well with other ideas in the family. Various ideas that can get included within the liberal family of values include the theoretical equality of individuals, such as equality of value, dignity, and opportunity. Freedom from tyranny, whether by government, religion, or corporations. Freedom of personal autonomy for personal self-rule. Protection of private property. The rule of law. Individual rights. Freedom of religion, and the neutrality of the state in religious matters. Development of individual interests and capacities. Tolerance of diversity, and overall societal progress. These can all sound great, yet at times some of these values actually clash, and so different types of liberalisms arise, depending on which of these values one prioritizes. For instance, a classic clash is seen in the political realm between right-wing and left-wing liberals. Right-wing liberals prioritize economic freedoms over social freedoms, meaning right-wing liberals prefer low individual taxes at the cost of diminished government social programs, and are often represented by political parties labeled conservative. While left-wing liberals prioritize social freedoms over economic freedoms, meaning they are willing to have higher taxes to fund social programs and government-provided services. This position is often represented by political parties with the label liberal. So conservative and liberal political parties are both liberal in the fundamental sense of prioritizing rights and opportunity for individuals, in contrast to highly conformist societies. But the two types of political parties look very different in their ideas because they prioritize different ideas within the liberal family of ideas. Now this brings us to the extreme end of the liberal family of ideas, namely Libertarianism, or hyper-individualism. What then is hyper-individualism? Well, it is the view that each individual should be free to pursue their behavioral preferences in life, to do as they like, and that society's values and structures should provide maximum freedom, liberty, for this pursuit. Some libertarians add the following limited constraint: so long as my preferences, behaviors, choices, don't interfere with yours, nor yours with mine. These behavioral preferences or choices can run the full range of human practices, including speech, what we say and how we say it, association, with whom we associate, property use, that is, how we acquire, use, and dispose of our assets and possessions, self-presentation, such as clothing and styles of self-decoration, entertainment, that is, our leisure activities, sex, with whom and how we have sex, religion, that is, religious speech and practices, and so forth. In summary so far, individualism is a set of social values in contrast to highly conformist or traditionalist social values. As we will see in the next videos, individualism took many centuries to emerge. Liberalism arises as the form individualism has taken over the last couple centuries, with the family of liberal ideas described earlier. And hyper-individualism arises as the most extreme form of liberalism. With liberalism's focus on individual freedoms, the question quickly arises: should any of our freedoms have boundaries? And if so, where should the boundaries or constraints lie? Hyper-individualism is the form of liberalism which promotes the least boundaries or constraints of all. Which brings us to our next value system, the common good, or Communitarianism, which places constraints on hyper-individualism not because communitarians lack a sense of fun or carefree adventure, but because they argue that excessive freedoms are not true freedoms, for excessive freedoms can actually harm us, as we saw in the introduction with the list we saw there of the sorts of harms that hyper-individualism can cause. In other words, some level of constraints are actually necessary for our fullest well-being. So communitarianism includes the following ideas or values. Fullest individual well-being depends on participation in healthy community or society, which includes patterns of cooperation. Members of a community or society see themselves as interdependent, and so are alert to whether their behaviors have positive or negative effects on others. Members of a community or society also see themselves as mutually responsible, though in varying degrees, and thus owe each other, though in varying degrees. Consequently, they seek a balance between their individual self-interest on the one hand and, on the other hand, self-constraint and self-giving for the benefit of all, or for the common good. All this mutual accountability, solidarity, and self-constraint collectively feeds back, even if often indirectly, to the benefit and well-being of each member of the community. In effect, the common good perspective argues descriptively that humanity is psychosocially constructed such that greatest wellness can come only within healthy community. And communitarianism argues prescriptively that forming healthy community is an imperative for the fullest well-being of individuals. Notice how different this is from hyper-individualism, where the imperative is on maximizing individual freedom, with the sole constraint being that my freedoms should not interfere with those of others. Of course, hyper-individualists object that the communitarian common good perspective overwhelms individual freedom. And yet, communitarians are liberals, for communitarians too value the various individual freedoms that are part of the liberal family of ideas and values. Communitarians just believe that our greatest well-being requires concern for the common good as well, and so that we choose to moderate our individual freedoms by intentional concern for our life in community. There is no mathematical formula that provides the right or correct balance between individual freedoms on the one hand and, on the other, self-constraint for the sake of others. If we were in a high-conformity society, my concern would be for greater individual freedom. This is precisely what we will see in our next chapter on Jesus, Paul, and the emergence of individualism. But in our libertarian culture, my concern is that the need for such a balance between individual freedom and concern for community impacts at least be recognized, and that people engage in discussion of what this balance best looks like in practice within the various spheres of life. Which brings us now to our third value system, humanitarianism, the desire to help those who are in need. This can be through philanthropy, that is, giving away one's financial resources to help others, or through one's commitment of time and effort to a good cause. One thinks, for instance, of those who work or volunteer with global humanitarian organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, the Red Cross, or World Vision, or with local humanitarian organizations that respond to local social needs, such as food banks, shelters, and the like. Where does humanitarianism come from in Western society? Well, there are two sources. Historically, it comes from the influence of Christianity. We'll see this in greater depth in the next chapter, but for now we can say that Greco-Roman culture, which was the context for the New Testament church, was harsh and cruel, and anything approaching concern for the hardship or suffering of others was considered a sign of weakness. The Jesus movement was the force that brought change in two ways: through its use of Jewish scriptures, which are full of justice concerns for those who are weak or vulnerable in some way, along with the life and teaching of Jesus to love God and love neighbor, including even to love one's enemies. So the Jesus movement launched the humanitarian impulse in Western culture. But we can say there's a second source too, the neural capacity everyone has for compassion and altruism. Helping others comes at some cost to oneself, whether that cost is limited or significant. This cost may be a financial cost because of giving away one's money, or a cost in one's social status, such as being condescendingly dismissed by others as a do-gooder, or even a cost of lost personal opportunity, that is, sacrificing opportunities for oneself in order to help others, perhaps even in some cases the cost of one's life. So altruism always comes with a cost, whether mild, moderate, or severe. The humanitarian impulse of compassion and altruism already exists in human nature, in our brains. But these do not provide humanity's default mode of living. Indeed, quite the opposite. Rather, evolution has produced in humans a priority on selfism. That is, attitudes and actions for survival and self-benefit, thus often putting oneself first. In contrast, compassion and altruism, though present in human nature, are not nearly as strong as selfism. Altruism can become a stronger motivational force in ourselves, but this requires intentional formation processes, such as through parenting or education or religious formation. But without such intentional external formative forces, altruism generally remains a weak motivational force within human nature, although altruism also develops within some people just out of their own experience of suffering and thus empathy for others. Because the capacity for altruism is neurologically found within all people, even if for many people it remains buried under their selfism, there are people, not just Jesus followers, but also from other religions as well as atheists, who choose to cultivate their life on the altruistic instinct of self-giving for the benefit of others. Consequently, due to both the historical influence of Christianity and to humanity's internal capacity for altruism, there exists within Western culture values of commitment to compassion, humanitarianism, and philanthropy. In contrast to humanitarianism, hyper-individualism is indifferent to the suffering of others, and in this sense conflicts with humanitarianism. Indeed, the most influential popular advocate of hyper-individualism has been the fiction writer Ayn Rand, author of two bestsellers, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, in which she describes her ideas. Rand called her version of libertarianism objectivism, or the philosophy of selfishness. That was her own label. Her philosophy of selfishness did not advocate taking advantage of others, but it did advocate indifference to others on the way to making life better for yourself. There is no concern in hyper-individualism to cultivate compassion or altruism. Nonetheless, while the humanitarian impulse is logically at odds with libertarianism, in daily life the two often coexist within individual lives, for people are quite able to operate with both in their lives, even if this is inconsistent. That is, in some parts of their lives, people can live with compassionate concern and humanitarian commitment, while in other parts of their lives, they live with libertarian values and behaviors. Now to summarize. In this chapter, I've discussed hyper-individualism, the common good, and communitarianism, in order to provide language by which to identify and describe some of the dominant underlying values in our society today. I've indicated my overall objective to critique hyper-individualism and to offer a Christian alternative for 21st century issues. But I will construct that Christian alternative in part 2 of this series. Before we get there, though, we need to understand better the history of how hyper-individualism emerged in Western culture. And in the next chapter, I'll begin this history, perhaps surprisingly, with the foundational role of Jesus, Paul, and Christianity in the emergence of individualism. In the meantime, I have a request. I'd be grateful if you could hit the like, subscribe, and share buttons so the YouTube algorithm can give this series some wider exposure. And now, on to Chapter 2.